Well, the Spurs lost 95-91 last night in Chi-Town, ending their 13-0 road win streak to start the season. They were looking to tie last season's Warriors for the most consecutive road wins to begin a season in NBA history. Head coach Gregg Popovich was very salty after the streak-breaking loss.
I don't remember playing tonight. I didn't play. Guys get a lot of money to be ready to play. No Newt Rockney speeches. It's your job. If you're a plumber and you don't do your job, you don't get any work. I don't think the plumber needs a pep talk. If the doctor botches operations, he's not a doctor anymore. If you're a basketball player, you come ready. It's called maturity. It's your job.
Pop, fired up. Do your job. Speaking of which, Stephen A., what responsibility does Pop have for his team's performance in terms of doing jobs?
As far as I'm concerned, very, very little. And the reason why I say that is because he's reached a point in his career where he has a license, or we have a license to take what he says and what he does for granted. I've been covering the NBA, Max, for over 2 decades. I never have encountered a time when I think that Gregg Popovich has lied about anything. I've never encountered a time where we've looked at him and we've said he didn't do his job because of effort. He may have made mistakes. There may have been something he could have done better. There were times, particularly during the NBA Finals loss to Tim Duncan, you got to remember that rebound that Chris Bosh captured and ultimately gave to Ray Allen to hit that time three. If I remember correctly, Tim Duncan wasn't on the floor. How can that not be? We might have questions about judgment calls from time to time because nobody's flawless. But there's 2 things that you can never, ever, ever say, possibly be 3 things you can never say about Gregg Popovich. You can never say he doesn't show up to work. You can't question his effort. You can't question his credentials. You can't question his honesty. These are the kind of things you can't question about this man. And so when he says what he says, first of all, he's absolutely right. Secondly, in today's generation, with the advent of social media and beyond, and everybody just as concerned about their brand as much as they're concerned about their performances and what have you, it's important that an old school dude, who, by the way, has won more than 69% of the games he's coached in his entire career, okay, and he's a 5-time champion, and 6 times he's been to the NBA Finals. He's universally recognized as the best coach in basketball, not to mention he's the guy that's going to succeed Coach K as the Olympic coach, okay? All of those credentials aside, we have to remember that this guy is a military man. He is about accountability. He is about making sure that you do the things that you're supposed to do. And when he says what he says last night, what he is saying is, we know what our job is. We know what our responsibilities are. And on occasion, there have been times this season where these guys haven't shown up effort-wise. And the person that I look at is a LaMarcus Aldridge. Because even though I haven't had an opportunity to watch every game for the San Antonio Spurs, and I'm not saying Gregg Popovich was talking about him. This is not insider information or anything. I'm just talking about what I'm seeing. I think that LaMarcus Aldridge is getting paid, and he is expected to do a lot. And I think the numbers that he's put forth and the energy that I anticipate and expected from him is not something I have seen when I have watched the Spurs play. He's not the only one. And I'm quite sure Gregg Popovich wasn't talking about just him. I'm just saying that I consider LaMarcus Aldridge big time. I have not seen a big time player in LaMarcus Aldridge for the San Antonio Spurs this season. That's the only reason I bring his name up.
You think about the Spurs, and going into this season, you pay them lip service, as you do every season. Very few seasons, unless they had some extraordinary performance in the finals the year before, are the Spurs the one that everyone's picking. Everyone will pay lip service. Yeah, they'll be in the running, but it'll be this team or that team. And yet, here we are, where it was obviously the Cavs and the Warriors, and I said the Clippers had the best chance to upset the apple cart. I think you took someone in the East because you know, I guess the Cavs are a little more vulnerable than the Warriors once they get Durant, or whatever your reasoning was. And here are the Spurs with a chance to tie the all-time mark for road wins to start a season. Like, think of how good they are. And why? Because Gregg Popovich takes nothing for granted, except a culture of professionalism that he tries to cultivate. He said, no Newt Rockne speeches. You don't need to give a plumber a Newt Rockne speech. That's your job. And these guys are getting paid a lot of money to do their job. So when he's asked, what about you? Don't you have to get them ready? Aren't you also paid a lot of money to do that? He says, no. I'm not out there playing. Basically, he's saying implicitly, I did my job. I came prepared. Some of these guys didn't.
Exactly.
Now, if another coach without his track record were to say that, that could be problematic. Time out, coach. Ultimately, the buck stops with you. You didn't have your guys ready. But when it's the greatest coach active in the NBA and one of the all-time great coaches in the history of American team sports, that holds much more weight. And I want to say something quickly about egos, because the Spurs are a team where people, ego don't apply with the Spurs. It's not about egos. On the contrary, you have to have an extremely strong ego to play on the Spurs, because that's a coach who he's not going to coddle you like a child, nor will he berate you as though you're a child, but he's also not going to hide the fact, he's not going to hide his displeasure. It doesn't matter who it is. Even Tim Duncan, at his best, he will dress him down if Tim Duncan doesn't do what he's supposed to do. No one is above that on that team. So you have to have the kind of ego that can handle that. A coach who's going to say it has to be strong and it has to be based on a foundation of putting in the work. And a coach who's going to say, these guys weren't ready to play. It's not my job to motivate them to play. On this team, that has to be part of who you are. And it's one of the reasons that insistence on that code of professionalism that Gregg Popovich is so great.
Well, I get your point, but, getting back to, isolating specific individuals. We watched the Chicago Bulls last night. Like, Dwayne Wade is making me out to be a liar. I believe they were going to get to the playoffs, but he feels they can make some noise, and they're playing like it, and they deserve a lot of credit. Him, Jimmy Butler, Rajon Rondo. By the way, Rajon Rondo getting a bad rap in certain respects, but we can elaborate on that another time. What I would tell you is this. You're going up against the Chicago Bulls. You're LaMarcus Aldridge. You shoot 5 of 15 from the field. The Spurs are minus 19 when you're on the floor. You're the successor to Tim Duncan. There's a responsibility that comes with that. He needs to play better. That's number one. Number two, there were rumors about him not being happy coming into the season. Young man, protege of mine, Jabari, wrote that. Mike Monroe, just a staple in the NBA community, one of the great NBA reporters in the history of this business, is also covering that game, covering that team. He's a dear friend of mine. LaMarcus Aldridge has better get his act together, because it's not just about Popovich. Those people covering the San Antonio Spurs, a few of whom I know personally, know what they're talking about with the game of basketball. Folks are going to start zeroing in on this man. LaMarcus Aldridge had better step up along with other people. He's better than that, and there are players on this team that are better than the way they're performing.
When Stephen A. says that, everybody, just keep in mind, it's not like, he's privy to a lot of information that no one else is.
We know. He calls himself Stephen Naismith. Guys, before we get back to football, though, one more NBA topic I want to get into right now surrounding your Knicks. Carmelo Anthony hit us with the subliminal tweets last night, first posting this, potentially touching on Phil Jackson's comments. Ego is the only requirement to destroy any relationship. So be a bigger person, skip the E, and let it go. Hashtag stay mellow. Then he hit us with this. A photo of Muhammad Ali with arrows and this caption, unfazed, my life summed up in one photo. Hashtag stay mellow. Stephen A., you siding with Melo or Phil on this one?
Of course, I'm siding with Melo. There's no question about it.
Okay.
Especially when you bring up the word ego. Because when we're talking about ego in this equation, we ain't talking about the player. We're talking about the president. Nobody on the Knicks team has a bigger ego than Phil Jackson. Nobody. And we all know that. So when Melo talks about the E, let's get rid of the E and let's go and all of this other stuff, he's talking about Phil Jackson. Phil Jackson needs to let go of the E. Phil Jackson needs to put his ego and check his ego at the door. Now, there's a lot of people that sit there and say, you're an 11-time champion. How dare you say that about this man? I'm going to remind everybody, I'm not talking about the 11-time champion. I'm talking about the novice executive. I'm not talking about the coach who coaches this team and deals with the players intimately on an everyday basis because they're playing for him every night. I'm talking about the novice executive who's operating from a distance and picks and chooses when he wants to get close and hires coaches but tries to coach for them and gets players and calls himself, exacting tutelage and what have you, but he's not vibing with them. A guy that refuses to adjust to what he has and tries to get everybody to adjust to who he is when he's always been known as a bit different, as a bit eccentric, and that there are not too many people who are like him, and he just doesn't get that. And so clearly Melo is talking about Phil Jackson, and when he's talking about the arrows, he's talking about the fools out there pointing the finger at him. Sure, he holds on to the ball a little bit sometimes. He's been notorious for that throughout his career. The great George Karl, who coached him for years in Denver, who used to work at ESPN, used to tell me that all the time. Larry Brown told me that before when he, working with him during the Olympic competition and stuff like that. But they said it with love and respect, because they know that Melo was big time. You can't find a coach on the planet that loves Melo more than Jim Boeheim at Syracuse, who Melo delivered the only championship in Syracuse's history in basketball to that program. This man loves Carmelo Anthony. And you got to remember that when he's talking about it, and when you're talking about Melo holding the ball, it's one thing to say that he holds the ball a little bit too long. It's another thing to imply that there's selfishness that comes with it. When Melo played on the Olympic with other big-time players, Melo shot the ball more than anybody else. Melo made shots more than anybody else. All of that stuff is true. You didn't hear none of those cats complaining about him because they said Melo's Melo, but he will also do what it takes to win. It's one thing, Max, to say that he holds the ball a little bit too long. It's another thing when those comments are tinged with insults where you're trying to imply he's far more selfish than he actually is, especially when you, Phil Jackson, yourself can be deemed a hell of a lot more selfish than Carmelo Anthony.
It's interesting in this business, when you say something positive about a player, you're considered pro that player or coach. And when you say something negative about them, you're against them. And I root for Carmelo Anthony. I also think he's an overrated player. And so when the topic of Carmelo comes up, I think there's an expectation among some people who are paying attention, I guess, at least on my timeline, that I'm going to take a shot. And they're right in this case, but not about this as it relates to Phil Jackson. I'm 100% on Carmelo's side in terms of the way he's handled this as it relates to Phil Jackson. The ego point is a really good one. He's staying above the fray. Good for him. It's a class move. He's an excellent offensive player, and his offense is so good that he's just an excellent player, period. I mean, he's one of the best players in basketball, top 10, top 15, wherever you want to put him. And so I'm with him. I don't love the way he dressed it up as like a phrase from a bad self-help book, but whatever, this is what athletes do. Where I think he went wrong, and this is like, oh, you got to throw shade on Carmelo. No, but he made the comment, so I'm going to comment on it. When he compares himself to Muhammad Ali with the arrows, this is what I guess rubs me the wrong way about Carmelo. His self-view is out of proportion to his actual quality or accomplishments, I should say, as an athlete and as an NBA player at least. Muhammad Ali felt persecuted because he converted, because he refused induction into the armed forces during the Vietnam War. He took a principled stand. He got death threats all the time and became a worldwide important figure. And Carmelo sometimes gets shots taken at him by basketball fans who says he held the ball too long, but when he says something like that, it gives the impression that he thinks he's more important than he is, and that he perceives the world as coming at him more than it does. I agree with him as it relates to Phil. I wish he hadn't said the second part.
No, I think you're wrong here, because a lot of times the visual impact of something usurps everything else. Take, for example, and this is an extreme example, Greg Hardy and his transgressions were just as bad as Ray Rice's were. But we got words from Greg Hardy because there was no video. Because the video was out there about Ray Rice, it was far more profound. And so when you live in a visual age what you're doing is you're not comparing yourself to Muhammad Ali. You're using Muhammad Ali to give the visual impact of what you believe you're feeling to make that point without really comparing yourself to Ali. I've known Melo for over a decade. I am telling you right now, Carmelo Anthony in no way believes that his situation is comparable to that of Muhammad Ali. He ain't built that way. That's not who he is.
I'm not saying that.
He does feel there's a shrapnel of criticism that's coming his way, but he doesn't feel that it's comparable to what Ali went through. That's not who he is.
First of all, I think that's a sophisticated rebuttal on your part. And I also appreciate the inside information that you just provided in terms of Carmelo's personality. And I don't mean to suggest he thinks he's Ali. What I'm saying is when he uses that image, it's impossible not to get the sense, at least from where I'm sitting, that he feels persecuted out of proportion to his actual circumstance, and that he feels that his position in the sports world is also elevated out of proportion to that circumstance. Based on his accomplishments, he's never won a championship.
Yeah, but he's feeling persecuted not by Max Kellerman. He's feeling persecuted by Phil Jackson. And if Phil Jackson's an 11-time champion, then those feelings of persecution would be far more profound because it ain't just coming from the media or Joe Public. It's coming from a guy who's revered.
Guys,
and that's what he's pointing out. And I think it's wise.
And on that issue, I stand with Carmelo. I think he was right to defend himself in that way.
Guys, really strong arguments. Agree with both of you. Great points on that one. Wish we had more time, but we have to move on.